Jasmine Crockett walked into court wearing a simple cross and was fined $1,000 on the spot. But just 5 minutes later, she flipped the courtroom on its head. That moment led to the shocking arrest of Justice Amy Coney Barrett and exposed a decade of religious bias from the bench. How did one necklace bring down a federal judge? And what else has the system been hiding behind the robe? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The wind outside the West Wing windows screamed like a warning, but Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on the urgent email flashing on her encrypted screen. POTUSPRIORITY. Observe civil court session in D.C. suspected systemic religious liberty violation. Remain anonymous. No attachments, no names, just a red flag waving in silence. Jasmine had seen this pattern before. In courtrooms where prayers were punished, where faith was labeled disruption. She defended veterans, immigrants, and single mothers silenced by fear. Now something bigger was moving. She stood, grabbed her coat, and opened the drawer. Inside, a silver crucifix on a tarnished chain, her father's, a fallen soldier. She clipped it on without hesitation, not for show, for strength. The battlefield was no longer overseas. It was inside the law itself, and she was walking straight into it. The courthouse loomed like a fortress, cold, gray, and echoing with the footsteps of the weary and the wronged. Jasmine moved past the security checkpoint with calm precision, handing over ID marked simply, J. Crockett, Independent Counsel. No badges, no mention of the White House, just enough to earn entry, not attention. The courtroom was packed, rows filled with ordinary citizens, teachers, veterans, parents, many clutching Bibles or rosaries, eyes heavy with frustration. They weren't criminals. They were plaintiffs, victims of whispered policies that banned public prayer in city parks, hospital waiting rooms, and even school parking lots. Jasmine felt it, the kind of tension that thickens the air, the kind that says something's wrong here, and everyone knows it. As she found her seat near the back, a security officer in a wrinkled uniform leaned close, voice barely above a breath. If you want no trouble, you might want to take that cross off. Justice Barrett doesn't like symbols. Jasmine didn't even blink. She turned slightly, just enough to meet the guard's eyes, and smiled. Not out of politeness, but with the stillness of a loaded weapon. Her fingers brushed the cross at her collar, then rested on her lap, unmoved. Noted, she said, her voice low, calm, final. The man hesitated, then backed away, disappearing into the wood-paneled shadows. Around her no one noticed, but Jasmine did. The warning wasn't about dress code. It was about power, and the way it trembled when someone refused to kneel. The silence that followed the guard's warning hadn't settled for more than a minute when the room shifted, like air pressure dropping before a storm. The double doors of the courtroom groaned open. Not fast, not loud, but slow and deliberate, as if announcing the arrival of someone who didn't need theatrics to command fear. Every head turned. The whispers died. Justice Amy Coney Barrett entered with the precision of a pendulum and the weight of a gavel already falling. Her robes were perfectly pressed, her steps measured, her chin slightly raised. Not out of arrogance, but authority carved over years of commanding obedience. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She didn't need to. Her presence alone drew the room into silence tighter than any court order. This was her domain, her courtroom, and the rules were whatever she decided they were that day. Her eyes scanned the gallery like floodlights sweeping a prison yard. They passed over restless feet, anxious hands, trembling folders, until they landed, sharp and unblinking, on Jasmine Crockett. It took less than a second. The cross on Jasmine's chest caught the fluorescent light, just enough to glint, and just enough to provoke. Barrett stopped mid-step. Her face didn't change, but her focus locked in with unsettling precision. She raised a single unshaking hand and pointed, not at Jasmine's face, not at her seat, but directly at her necklace. Her voice cut through the courtroom with a coldness that didn't need to be loud. It was clean, surgical. You there, that necklace violates this court's neutrality. Remove it, immediately. The impact was instant. A few gasps escaped. Papers rustled. A mother in the back clutched her purse closer. Even the court clerk paused, fingers hovering over her keyboard. But Jasmine didn't move. The chain around her neck, worn and dulled with time, rested calmly over her collarbone, as steady as her heartbeat. Justice Barrett didn't repeat herself. She didn't have to. The tension in the room thickened, stretching into the space between them, like a drawn wire. This wasn't a dress code issue. It wasn't protocol. It was a line drawn in silence, and Jasmine had just been dared to cross it. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Not when the courtroom fell dead silent, not under the sharp weight of Justice Barrett's stare, and not when the unspoken threat hung thick in the air like smoke before a fire. She remained seated, posture upright, shoulders squared, her breath steady like someone trained to keep calm under fire. Her fingers, resting gently on the armrest, didn't tremble. Instead, one hand moved slowly, almost ceremonially, to brush the silver cross on her chest. A deliberate gesture, a silent refusal. She met Barrett's eyes across the courtroom, gaze steady and unyielding. There was no anger, no arrogance, only a stillness that said, "You may hold the bench, but I will not bend." And then, with a voice low, unwavering, and sharp enough to cut through the tension, she replied, "No." The word dropped like a match into dry hay. Instant ignition. A collective gasp rippled across the courtroom, as if the crowd had been holding their breath. The court clerk's fingers froze above the keys. The bailiff turned his head, unsure if he was about to witness defiance or history. Justice Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line, her jaw tightening beneath the harsh lights. And then, with cold precision, she reached for the gavel. The sound when it struck the bench was thunderous, violent, final. "Contempt of court," she announced, her voice louder now, rising with the force of barely restrained fury. $1,000, payable before you leave this courtroom." Gas spread like wildfire. The clerk hesitated before typing. Even the bailiff shifted uneasily, as if unsure whether this was justice or something darker. But what Justice Barrett mistook for surrender was something far more deliberate, control cloaked in restraint. Jasmine didn't wince. She didn't flinch. Her face remained unreadable, carved from something harder than pride, steadier than fear. The courtroom's silence seemed to press in on her from all sides, but she moved with the stillness of someone who lived through louder wars. Slowly, calmly, she rose from her seat. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice. Every step toward the front of the room was measured, precise, like walking a tightrope over a canyon of consequence. The click of her heels echoed through the gallery, steady and certain, slicing through the tension like a metronome counting down to impact. All eyes tracked her, breath held, uncertain of what came next. Protest? Collapse? Concession? She reached the podium and paused. Then, with the grace of someone unfazed by courtroom theatrics, Jasmine slipped a hand into the inner pocket of her blazer. From it, she withdrew a slim black wallet, no larger than a passport, and opened it with a single, fluid motion. The leather creaked softly as it unfolded, revealing a polished badge embossed in gold, flanked by an official federal seal and an ID card beneath it. The words glinted under the courtroom lights. Executive Office, Civil Oversight Division, Special Federal Authority. She held the badge high, her voice calm but clear, slicing through the thick silence with the sharpness of truth. "My name is Jasmine Crockett. I am Senior Legal Advisor to the President of the United States, assigned by executive order to oversee civil court compliance with constitutional rights. I am here under full federal authority." She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of those words did all the work. A ripple moved through the room. Shock, disbelief, then realization. Justice Barrett's stare didn't waver, but her posture shifted. Just enough for those watching closely to see it. The woman behind the bench had issued judgment, but the woman before her had just taken the gavel and rewritten the rules. And as the courtroom grappled with the weight of her badge and title, Jasmine did not let the silence settle. She weaponized it. Lowering the leather wallet with deliberate care, Jasmine placed it on the podium like a final card in a high-stakes game. Her voice came next, not loud but focused, clear, and impossible to ignore. This courtroom, she said, pausing just enough for the silence to pull tighter around her words, does not stand above the Constitution, and no official in this room, not even Your Honor, has the right to override it. Every syllable landed with weight, striking through the haze of shock like iron dropped on glass. People turned in their seats, some slowly, others all at once, as if finally seeing the shape of what was unfolding. Even the court clerk, frozen in front of her keyboard, leaned forward now, lips parted slightly. Jasmine didn't move her shoulders, didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The authority in her voice wasn't drawn from emotion. It came from the law itself. The First Amendment of the United States Constitution, she continued, guarantees every citizen the right to freely exercise their faith, without coercion, without punishment, and without fear. She took one measured step closer to the bench, the distance shrinking, the stakes rising. Her gaze met Barrett's directly. No malice, no plea, only a piercing clarity that cut through the facade of robes and formality. By demanding I remove this cross, she said, touching the symbol resting against her chest, you have not defended neutrality. You have violated it, because neutrality is not silence. It is equal treatment. A few audible gasps flickered through the room, the tension now not only palpable, but visible in how people sat, breathed, watched. Jasmine let the moment expand, then delivered the strike. I invoke the 1993 Supreme Court precedent, Church of Lukumi Babalu Aye, Sir City of Hialeah. That ruling, binding and clear, held that the government cannot impose restrictions that specifically target religious expression under the false banner of order or neutrality. The court in that decision made it crystal clear. When power singles out faith, even subtly, it ceases to be justice. It becomes oppression. Her words hung in the air, sharpened by the undeniable truth behind them. There was no theatrics, no dramatic pause for applause, just the sound of reality settling like thunder before the storm. Jasmine Crockett wasn't performing. She was indicting. And as the echoes of precedent faded into the charged silence, Jasmine didn't stop. She turned the mirror back onto the court itself and forced it to look. Her tone didn't rise, but her words carried more force than a shouted accusation. They were methodical, sharpened, and deliberate, like a surgeon cutting through illusion. Let's examine the standard being enforced here, she said, slowly turning her head to scan the courtroom. Because what you call neutrality, what you just used to justify a $1,000 fine, isn't being applied equally. Her hand gestured lightly, not with drama, but with clarity. To my left, a man sits in full view wearing a t-shirt that displays explicit language that would violate most workplace policies, let alone the dignity of this courtroom. And yet, not a word was said. She turned slightly, eyes falling on another. To my right, a woman entered this room with a gold-plated pendant shaped like a cannabis leaf, oversized, flashing under the lights. No objection, no demand to remove it. No accusations of disrupting the room's so-called neutrality. She took a step closer to the bench, not aggressive, but direct, unblinking. Behind me, a young man is wearing earrings so large and loud, I heard them jangle through the clerk's opening roll call. Still, nothing. And there, she pointed briefly, a visitor with a hoodie that reads, "Trust no one," in bold red letters. Cynical, antagonistic, suggestive. Yet not one comment, not one reprimand. The room felt smaller now, tighter, as if the very walls were closing in on the false sense of order that had just been exposed. Jasmine's voice lowered, not to whisper, but to focus every syllable like a scalpel. But when I entered wearing a silver cross, no sound, no message, no protest, that's when the gavel dropped. That's when the court found its voice. She paused, locking eyes with Justice Barrett, letting the truth sit heavy between them. That isn't about order. It isn't about neutrality. It's about what makes you uncomfortable. Her tone didn't waver. You tolerated expression until that expression was faith. You ignored distraction until that distraction was belief. And you stayed silent until that silence spoke of something sacred. She let the silence build one more time before landing the final blow. That's not justice. That's discrimination wearing a black robe. And just as Jasmine's final words hung heavy in the courtroom like smoke after gunfire, the tension snapped, not from the bench, but from the silence that had been forced on someone who knew too much for far too long. From behind the clerk's desk, there was movement, small at first, hesitant, but unmistakable. A chair scraped softly against the floor. The court's senior stenographer, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair pinned tightly at the back of her head, slowly stood. For years, she had been part of the courtroom's furniture, present, precise, and invisible. Her fingers had typed every ruling, every order, every silence masquerading as protocol. But now her hands no longer hovered over the keyboard. They moved with a different purpose. Reaching beneath her desk, she pulled out a large, weathered manila folder. Its edges were frayed, corners curled from age and use. A single red string wrapped tightly around it. Not neatly, but with the urgency of something hidden. Something someone once tried to forget. The woman stepped out from behind the desk, her heels echoing across the marble like a slow drum beat. The room didn't breathe. No one stopped her. She walked straight to Jasmine, holding the folder close to her chest like a confession, and then, without ceremony, extended it. Her voice when she spoke cracked slightly, but not from fear. From the weight of truth finally being released. I've kept these records off the books. 23 rulings, all with one thing in common. Justice Barrett handed down harsher sentences when the defendants wore crosses, carried prayer beads, or spoke of their faith. No one believed me. Or maybe they didn't want to. Jasmine took the folder slowly, her expression unreadable, but her eyes razor-sharp. Around the room, heads turned. No one whispered. No one dared. The courtroom had shifted again, this time under the gravity of evidence. And with that single act, the narrative cracked wide open. It was no longer a matter of opinion. It was record. It was pattern. It was proof. And as Jasmine clutched the folder in her hands, truth bundled in paper and silence, she knew it was no longer a matter of testimony. It was time to show them. She moved with quiet purpose across the courtroom, the thick manila file pressed tightly to her side, like a weapon both sacred and damning. The courtroom projector sat dormant in the corner, ignored by most, forgotten by others. But Jasmine turned toward it with precise intent. She handed the folder to the bailiff, her voice calm but firm. "Display these." One by one. Her fingers tapped the podium with the rhythm of resolve, not hesitation. The bailiff hesitated for half a second, then obeyed. The screen lit up with a flicker, and then settled into a grainy courtroom still. Jasmine faced the gallery now, not the bench, her voice clear as glass. "Exhibit 1, she said. The image was unmistakable. A school courtroom, a skinny teenage boy standing stiffly in front of the judge's bench. His shoulders were hunched, his hands clasped in front of him, and around his neck, just barely visible above his hoodie, was a thin silver cross. He was 15, Jasmine continued, accused of a hallway altercation. First offense, no serious injuries. Recommended sentence, 2 weeks community service. Actual ruling?" She turned toward the bench. 60 days in juvenile detention. Reason listed in the court notes. Displayed religious symbolism in a defiant manner. The murmurs began immediately, low at first, then louder. Jasmine didn't respond. She simply nodded to the bailiff. Next. The screen shifted. Now a photo of a courtroom hallway. A young man, early 20s, dressed in a modest shirt and jeans, being led out by 2 bailiffs. His head was covered with a traditional Muslim hijab, not elaborate, not even political, just faith. He was attending a civil mediation between family members, Jasmine narrated. He was quiet. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't interrupt. She let the words settle before continuing. He was removed from the courtroom before the hearing even began. On-record reason, potential distraction due to attire. She looked toward Barrett now slowly. Unconstitutional, unjustified, unanswered. A ripple of discomfort rolled through the room, now visibly changing in posture. People who had once sat with passive attention were leaning forward, lips tight, brows furrowed. Jasmine's expression remained neutral, controlled, but never cold. Next, she said again. The third slide was the clearest yet. A still frame, zoomed in from courtroom footage. A middle-aged woman in a navy blue dress sat at the witness stand, her face pale, her mouth half open mid-sentence. On her wrist, a wooden string of Buddhist prayer beads, no larger than a bracelet. She was testifying in her divorce case, Jasmine explained. She had not violated any rules of decorum. She had not raised her voice. She was stopped mid-testimony. She paused, letting that land. Court record states, visibly agitated, wearing religious accessories. Her testimony was stricken, her affidavit excluded. The courtroom shifted again, but this time something deeper cracked. The murmurs were no longer passive. A woman in the back row placed her hand over her chest. A man whispered angrily to his wife. Another shook his head slowly, lips pressed in disbelief. And amid it all, Jasmine stood still. Not triumphant, not performative, just present, letting the truth speak where justice had failed. She turned slightly, her voice lowering, tone sharpened. All three cases occurred in this courtroom. All three were presided over by Justice Barrett. All three were dismissed or penalized on grounds that clearly reflect a pattern, not of maintaining order, but of silencing faith. She looked directly at the judge now. A crucifix, a hijab, a prayer bead. Three faiths, three people, one courtroom, one common result, punishment. Barrett remained motionless. No rebuke, no denial. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, but her posture betrayed the weight now crushing the authority she had once wielded unchallenged. Jasmine took a step back from the podium, her voice now even and quiet, but every word landing with impact. This isn't about a dress code. It's not about decorum. It's not even about the rule of law. She glanced at the gallery, every eye fixed on her. It's about power deciding whose beliefs are welcome and whose are dangerous. It's about faith being treated like a threat and symbols of devotion punished like rebellion. She paused, letting the screen dim slowly behind her, the last image flickering before fading to black. The silence that followed was not like the one before. It was heavier. It wasn't just stunned. It was loaded with realization. For the first time since the trial began, the crowd wasn't just watching a conflict. They were witnessing a reckoning. And Jasmine didn't have to say it aloud, because now everyone in that room already knew. This courtroom had rules, but they hadn't been applied. Not equally, not fairly, not legally. And just as the final image faded from the screen and the last word left Jasmine's lips, Justice Barrett shifted in her seat, her hand moving toward the gavel as if to reclaim control. Her fingers tightened around the polished wood, knuckles whitening. She opened her mouth, poised to speak, to reassert her power with one more ruling, perhaps to silence Jasmine, to strike her words from the record, or to issue yet another fine. But she never got the chance. The double doors of the courtroom swung open with a sudden, resounding force, like a thunderclap tearing through a storm. Heads turned, conversations halted mid-breath, and then they entered. 4 federal agents, crisp black suits, steel in their eyes and urgency in every step. They moved quickly but without panic, measured and trained. Their presence alone overpowered the room, as if justice had taken human form and stepped into the heart of its own corruption. The lead agent approached the bench without pause, pulling a trifold document from his coat. His voice was calm, authoritative, and crystal clear. "Justice Amy Coney Barrett," he declared, holding the document high for all to see. The golden seal of the Department of Justice catching the light. "You are hereby placed under federal investigation for repeated violations of the First Amendment, abuse of judicial discretion, and systemic religious discrimination in your courtroom." The words hit the chamber like a detonation. Gasps rippled through the gallery, sharp, visceral, unstoppable. Some clutched the benches, others whispered in disbelief, but no one moved. No one dared to interrupt what was unfolding. The agent continued, his tone unwavering. "We have a signed warrant for your immediate removal and detention. You are to come with us, now." Barrett froze. The color drained from her face. Her mouth, still half open from the sentence she never finished, now trembled slightly. The gavel remained in her hand, but it no longer meant anything. Power, once absolute, had collapsed into silence. She stood slowly, stiffly, her eyes not meeting anyone's. Not the gallery, not the clerk, not even Jasmine. Her composure cracked just for a breath as the agent stepped closer. Then came the moment no one in that room would forget, the metallic click of handcuffs locking around her wrists. It was louder than the gavel, louder than the whispering, louder than anything she had said all day. From the back row, a single voice broke the stunned silence. A man, older, weary, his voice hoarse but full of raw truth, spoke with quiet power. Justice has finally arrived. That was it. No cheering, no applause, just truth echoing off the walls of a courtroom that had too long forgotten what justice looked like. Barrett was led past the gallery, her shoulders squared but her steps heavy. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. She simply walked, past the people she once silenced, past the bench that no longer obeyed her, and past the cross on Jasmine Crockett's chest, which remained exactly where it had always been. Jasmine stood motionless at the podium, watching as the agents led Barrett out through the very doors she had once entered with such command. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She didn't move to claim victory. She only stood firm, calm, composed, resolute, as if she had seen this moment long before it happened. The courtroom that once sought to punish her now bore witness to something far greater, accountability in its purest form. And as the heavy courtroom doors closed behind Justice Barrett and the last echo of the handcuffs faded, a new silence fell, not empty, but cleansed. Jasmine stood still for a moment longer than anyone else, letting the weight of what had just happened settle into her bones. Then, without a word, she turned away from the podium, her heels clicking slowly across the marble floor, each step steady, grounded, and final. As she approached the exit, the crowd parted wordlessly, making way not for a hero, not for a celebrity, but for a woman who had stood alone and never once lowered her voice or her gaze. The air outside the courtroom felt colder, sharper, like the world was holding its breath. Jasmine reached the bottom of the courthouse steps, paused under the harsh glow of the midday sun, and lifted her hand to her neck. With slow fingers, she unclasped the thin chain of the silver cross that had started it all. She didn't wear it now out of rebellion or fear. She held it, tightly, deliberately, fist clenched around metal that had become more than a symbol. It was a promise, a vow, a reminder that some truths are worth bleeding for, even in silence. The media explosion didn't wait. It ignited. Within minutes of Barrett's removal, phones buzzed, news alerts flashed, and camera crews raced to the courthouse steps. But Jasmine didn't speak to the press. She didn't need to. The story had already written itself, and the country was reading it in real time. Online, hashtags surged like wildfire. Crossfire was first, trending nationally within 15 minutes. Then came hashtag Barrett bias, picked up by legal watchdogs and civil rights organizations, with screenshots, transcripts, and courtroom footage already circulating. But the one that captured the nation's pulse was number Faith Under Fire, a battle cry that swept across states, ideologies, and belief systems. It wasn't about religion alone. It was about power, misused, exposed, confronted. In churches and mosques, in coffee shops and courthouses, people were talking. Veterans who had fought for freedom posted their own stories of being silenced in public spaces. Students reposted videos of being disciplined for prayer on campus. Parents shared photos of children with religious jewelry blurred in school portraits. The nation had seen injustice before, but never in such plain daylight, never so publicly undone. And at the heart of the storm stood Jasmine Crockett, not speaking, not posting, not seeking credit. She simply returned to her office in the West Wing, laid the silver cross gently on her desk beside the file folder that had cracked a judge's career, and sat in silence. She knew the storm had only begun, but for once, it wasn't swallowing the truth. It was clearing space for it. Within hours, the president took to the podium in the White House press briefing room. He wasn't flanked by advisors or shielded by talking points. His tone was firm, solemn, unmistakably direct. "What happened in that courtroom today?" he began, pausing as the room fell silent. was not just a confrontation between one woman and one judge. It was a mirror held up to the justice system, a reflection we've ignored for too long. He adjusted the microphone, his gaze unwavering. Thanks to Jasmine Crockett, we didn't just protect faith, we exposed systemic rot, and now we begin the work of removing it. Flashbulbs burst, reporters fired questions, but the message had already hit the front page of every major outlet in America. WH advisor confronts judge in court, religious discrimination uncovered. Jasmine Crockett holds court accountable, Barrett removed in real time. In just 24 hours, the story wasn't just national, it was personal. Households across the country debated the footage. Church groups rallied behind Jasmine. Law professors assigned her courtroom defense to constitutional law students. And within Congress, pressure mounted. Hearings were proposed, reform bills were drafted. Civil rights groups demanded judicial audits across all 50 states. Meanwhile, Jasmine remained quiet, not because she was hiding, but because she knew something louder than words was now speaking for her. The truth, finally unshackled. She didn't return to the spotlight immediately. Instead, she worked late into the night at her desk, cross-resting in the center like a compass. Her inbox flooded with messages, from young interns to retired judges, each carrying a common thread. You gave us courage. But Jasmine didn't seek celebration. She was focused on the next step. Accountability had begun, but change still had to be written into law. Back in the courtroom she had just left hours before, the judge's bench sat empty, cold, exposed, and for the first time in years, humble. The American flag behind it fluttered softly from the draft through the open doors. And across the city, in offices and chambers, people were asking one another hard questions. Who else had ruled unfairly? Who else had been silenced? Who would be next to stand? But they all knew one name, spoken in every newsroom, whispered in every hallway, etched now into the lexicon of justice: Jasmine Crockett. And on social media, where moments die fast and headlines fade even faster, her story stayed. Not as a fleeting trend, but as a watershed, a symbol, a shift. The hashtags didn't just trend. They carved themselves into the record of a nation at a crossroads. In homes where prayers had once been whispered quietly, they were now said aloud. In courtrooms where symbols were once banned, they began to reappear, silent, proud, unashamed. And in the hearts of millions who had once felt powerless, something stirred. The belief that one voice, held firm in the face of power, could ignite change far beyond a courtroom. The cross in Jasmine's hand had not been decoration. It had been defiance. And now, across a divided nation, it had become a beacon. And as the headlines roared and the public demanded more than applause, they demanded action. Jasmine Crockett stepped not away from the fire, but deeper into it. The storm she had ignited in one courtroom had rolled across the country, cracking open doors long sealed shut. But Jasmine hadn't stood that day for a moment of glory. She had stood for change, real change. And the White House knew it. Within days of the courtroom confrontation, her name rose from viral hashtag to official nomination. In a unanimous executive appointment, Jasmine Crockett was named senior advisor for the reform of judicial religious protections, a new role carved by necessity, forged from truth. She was no longer just an enforcer of the law. Now she was tasked with rebuilding part of it. Her new office wasn't far from the Oval, but it felt worlds apart from the courtroom where it all began. Glass walls, steel shelves, thick folders already stacked high, cases, statistics, audit reports. Every corner whispered urgency, but amid the modern furnishings and clean lines, one object stood out. Jasmine stood before it in silence the morning she moved in. A small frame, mounted at eye level, hung on the wall just to the left of her desk. Inside, a simple 8.5 by 11 slip of official court paper, a receipt for $1,000. Time-stamped, signed, stamped, paid. The fine issued against her for wearing a cross in a public courtroom. She had paid it the very next day, not in defeat, but with purpose. Not because she owed them silence, but because she owed herself the reminder. Beneath the receipt, etched into a thin plaque of brushed steel, were the words she had written by hand before handing it to the framer. One fine for staying silent can cost generations their voice. The staff that passed her office often stopped to read it. Some stood there for minutes absorbing the message. Others walked away with tears in their eyes. And Jasmine? She looked at it every morning, just once, before sitting at her desk. It wasn't a wound. It was a weapon, a warning. And it reminded her of exactly what she was fighting. Systems that mistake silence for peace. From that office, she began to move. Carefully, relentlessly. Her team, handpicked, wasn't made of politicians, but of people who had once been victims of the very system they were now empowered to fix. Former public defenders, civil rights advocates, faith leaders from across the religious spectrum. Together, they reviewed over 10,000 pages of past judicial behavior, scanning for signs of religious bias. The pattern was undeniable. The silence that once protected injustice was being peeled back, layer by layer, under Jasmine's direction. She pushed for mandatory First Amendment retraining for all federal judges. She drafted language for a Religious Expression Protection Act, legislation designed to prevent any court in the nation from ever penalizing belief as if it were a crime. And when opposition came, as it always did, she didn't flinch. She stood behind podiums, sat before Senate committees, and looked lawmakers in the eye as she said, "The courtroom is not your sanctuary. It belongs to the people, all people." The nation watched and listened, because they knew she had already proved she could stand alone and win. Yet inside her new office, even in the heart of political power, Jasmine never let herself forget where it started. That fine, those digits on paper, were more than an insult. They were a line drawn in ink where fear had once drawn it in silence. She had crossed it, and now she was clearing it for others, one policy at a time, one courtroom at a time. There were nights she stayed long after the halls emptied, the light from her desk the only glow in a sleeping wing. She would lean back in her chair, eyes fixed on that receipt. Not to relive the humiliation, but to remember the cost of indifference, the price of silence, and the power of one act of defiance to ripple through institutions, traditions, and generations. The cross she had once worn now rested in a glass box on her bookshelf, not out of reach, but displayed with reverence. Not as a relic, but as a badge, a reminder that belief should never need permission, and that the Constitution was not a theory, it was a shield, and she had chosen to raise it. So when the president called her name during his next address to the nation, when he said, "Thanks to Jasmine Crockett, faith is no longer on trial in America," she didn't smile for the cameras. She smiled for the truth, because the system hadn't given her power. It had tried to take it. And in standing her ground, Jasmine hadn't just reclaimed her own rights. She'd carved a path for millions who came after. And the framed fine on her wall remained, not as a trophy, but as a promise. Never again. And as Jasmine sat quietly in her new office, the framed fine still glowing softly in the morning light, the outside world erupted, because truth, once unleashed, doesn't wait for permission to move. Within hours of Justice Barrett being let out of the courtroom in handcuffs, footage of the moment, grainy, handheld, unfiltered, had rocketed across the internet like a detonation. Someone in the gallery had captured the very second the handcuffs clicked, the stunned gasp of the crowd, the sharp command from the lead agent. That 14-second clip was reposted over 10 million times within the first day. Newsrooms scrambled, anchors cut into programming, headlines screamed across the nation's screens in bold fonts and staccato urgency. Sitting judge arrested for religious discrimination, live in courtroom. But the name that dominated every headline wasn't Barrett's, it was Jasmine's. She hadn't spoken publicly since the hearing. She hadn't posted a statement. But that silence only made the legend louder. The media gave her a name almost instantly, the quiet warrior of the Constitution. It stuck, not because it was catchy, but because it was true. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't stormed the bench. She had simply stood, spoke with law and logic, and let truth do the damage. And in doing so, she had become something rare, a symbol with no slogan, a fighter with no sword, a reformer born not in office, but in resistance. The wave that followed was immediate, and it was seismic. In Texas, the governor held a press conference within 24 hours, flanked by a coalition of religious leaders and legal advisors. We will be reviewing every court decision in our state from the last 5 years involving claims of religious discrimination, he declared, the Texas flag billowing behind him. Not because we assume guilt, but because trust in justice demands transparency. Ohio followed within hours, announcing a bipartisan committee to audit municipal courts. Then Florida joined, stating flatly, "No bench is immune, no robe makes you untouchable." It wasn't just politics, it was cultural shock. Faith groups from every spectrum, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, released joint statements thanking Jasmine for reminding the country that belief doesn't belong to one party or one interpretation. She had defended the idea that the First Amendment wasn't conditional. It didn't bend under discomfort. And it damn sure didn't stop at courtroom doors. But while the public roared in support, the system itself began to turn inward. Judges who had once nodded in silent agreement with Barrett now found themselves on the defensive. Journalists unearthed transcripts. Advocates filed Freedom of Information Act requests. In district courts across the country, quiet murmurs of pattern and precedent began to echo louder than ever before. Courtroom staff who had stayed silent, clerks, bailiffs, recorders, started speaking up. "She used to do the same," one anonymous clerk said about her own judge in an interview with the Washington Post. "I thought it was just how things worked. Jasmine proved it wasn't." Suddenly, oversight committees had more work than they could process. In D.C., the Judicial Review Board announced an emergency inquiry into 6 other judges accused of similar behavior. Judges whose records bore eerie resemblances to Barrett's. Sentences extended, testimony struck, witnesses dismissed, all with one common trait: religious expression somewhere in the room. Jasmine hadn't exposed a single judge. She had pulled back the curtain on a practice so deeply embedded it had become invisible. Until now. Legal scholars debated it on every channel. "She didn't just cite precedent," one constitutional law professor said on a CNN panel. "She became the precedent." And amid all of this, Jasmine never once claimed credit. She declined every interview. She sent no tweets. Her silence wasn't strategic. It was steady, grounded. While the world reacted, she prepared. While others screamed in outrage or praise, she built policy. Her work was already underway, drafting judicial ethics codes, consulting on new federal guidelines, building a database to track future violations. But even in her silence, she was heard. In a small courtroom in Nebraska, a judge paused his sentencing, looked out over the gallery and said, "This bench is not for my beliefs. It's for the people's rights." Jasmine Crockett reminded us of that. The room applauded, not because of politics, because justice had a name again. And in the courthouse where it all began, someone had placed a single rose on the now empty bench where Barrett once sat. No card, no explanation. Just a silent marker of what had ended and what had begun. Because in just 24 hours, Jasmine hadn't merely changed the course of one courtroom. She had shifted the ground beneath an entire system. And as judges across the country felt the heat of scrutiny begin to rise, the system itself, long shielded by formality and fear, was finally forced to look inward. What began as public outrage and statewide audits quickly escalated into something far more coordinated, far more calculated. Within 72 hours of Justice Barrett's arrest, the Department of Justice and the Office of the Inspector General jointly announced the launch of Operation Blind Gavel, a federal investigation unlike anything in recent memory. Its mission was explicit: to root out systemic patterns of judicial abuse tied to religious discrimination across the United States. Its name was deliberate, Blind Gavel, because justice, they said, had been blindfolded not by impartiality, but by willful ignorance. Teams were formed, sealed indictments were drafted, and internal court communications were subpoenaed across multiple circuits. For the first time in decades, the judiciary itself was the subject, not the speaker. Reporters, stunned by the scale of the probe, called it the most aggressive legal introspection since the Watergate era. The country watched, riveted, as headlines rolled in. Judges resigning under pressure, others lawyering up, some choosing silence, others lashing out. The judiciary, once insulated by the public's lack of access or understanding, was now being dissected, case by case, ruling by ruling, in full view of a nation hungry for accountability. But while investigators combed through decades of misconduct, the White House turned its eyes to something even more radical: prevention. And for that, they knew only one person could lead the charge. Inside the West Wing, in a room where history had been debated but rarely rewritten, Jasmine Crockett stood before a wall of whiteboards, each marked with timelines, legal doctrines, and names of key judicial figures. She had not asked for this position. She hadn't lobbied, hadn't pitched, hadn't raised her hand. She had simply stood when others sat, and for that, she had been handed the most formidable task of her career. The order came straight from the top: create a binding national ethics framework for all federal judges. Not a suggestion, not a code of conduct with loopholes, but a standard, concrete, enforceable, permanent. Something that could outlive administrations, transcend ideologies, and survive courts stacked by politics. Something that would restore the people's faith not in judges, but in justice itself. There was no precedent, no template, no manual, and Jasmine knew exactly why. Because the system had never expected to be reformed by someone it once tried to punish. Her office became a war room, papers scattered across mahogany, experts called in from every corner of constitutional law. Faith leaders, civil rights attorneys, retired justices, each brought their scars and their expertise. Jasmine listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, it was only to cut through the noise with precision. We're not here to punish judges. We're here to prevent the next Barrett from ever sitting behind a bench. Every clause she wrote, every safeguard she built into the policy, came from real pain. Cases like the teenager sentenced for wearing a crucifix, the mother's silence for holding prayer beads, the imam escorted out before he spoke. She etched those stories into policy as if the law itself needed to remember what it had once forgotten. Her first draft, titled the Fair Bench Act, outlined sweeping reforms: mandatory First Amendment training for all sitting judges, an independent federal review board with subpoena power, a public-facing database of judicial complaints, and strict penalties for ideological bias in sentencing. Some called it overreach, some called it political suicide, but Jasmine called it necessary. The president backed her, publicly and without hesitation. "This isn't a witch hunt," he said in a nationally televised address. "This is a rescue mission for justice and for the millions who walk into courtrooms every day praying that their beliefs won't be used against them." His words were met with thunderous applause, but Jasmine didn't hear them from a podium. She was in her office, sleeves rolled, revising Clause 17 to close a loophole on discretionary sentencing. Still, the pushback came. Conservative think tanks accused her of weaponizing oversight. Hardline progressives said the reforms didn't go far enough. Judicial unions threatened walkouts. But Jasmine never swayed. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She held the same calm, cold steel that had carried her through Barrett's courtroom. And when asked by a journalist if she feared the scope of what she was building, she answered without blinking, "What I fear more is another generation too afraid to speak." And so Operation Blind Gavel pressed forward, exposing, confronting, shaking the foundations of unchecked power. And in a room just steps from the Oval Office, Jasmine Crockett wrote history, not with speeches but with statutes, not with protests but with policy. She was not trying to be remembered. She was trying to make sure others were never forgotten. Because justice, she believed, was not blind. It was watching. And now, finally, it had opened its eyes. And as Jasmine's reforms gained traction, gaining legal momentum and national support, the very system she was rebuilding began to reveal its resistance. Deep, bitter, and dangerously quiet. It started subtly: press releases from obscure judicial councils, opinion columns from concerned constitutionalists, anonymous op-eds warning of executive overreach cloaked in reform. But soon it sharpened into something far more coordinated. A coalition emerged, an alliance of hardline federal judges, career politicians with ties to legacy court structures, and deep-pocketed lobbyists who had long viewed the judiciary as their last untouchable fortress. They gave their movement a name: Hands Off the Bench. It sounded innocuous, almost reasonable, but behind the slogan was a brutal campaign designed to discredit, dismantle, and destroy Jasmine's credibility. Their message flooded certain media outlets. Crockett is a political puppet, they claimed, an activist in a suit, a mouthpiece for a White House bent on controlling the courts. Primetime anchors questioned her legal experience, twisted her courtroom stand into a PR stunt, and painted her as a threat to judicial independence. But it didn't stop with talking points. It got personal. Leaked emails began to surface. One in particular drew national attention. Dated 2 months before Barrett's arrest, written by a former senior aide to the judge, the message was blunt, venomous, and chilling in its arrogance. "We spent a decade building this structure, carefully, quietly. She's not going to tear it down just because she wore a cross and made a scene." The email ignited a firestorm. The public was stunned by its cold confidence, but to Jasmine it confirmed what she already knew. She wasn't just fighting policy. She was fighting power, entrenched, generational, ruthless, and the backlash escalated. Security at her office was doubled after an anonymous threat scrawled in red ink was delivered to her West Wing mailbox. "We don't need judges who fear God. We need ones who fear us." Her staff grew quiet, more alert, more careful. Background checks were rerun. Visitors were vetted twice. Jasmine didn't flinch, but she adjusted. Her every movement was tracked now, by allies and enemies alike. Then one morning, as the sun rose over Washington, she arrived at her office to find a sheet of paper taped to the glass door. It wasn't typed. It wasn't even large. Just a single handwritten line, black ink bleeding slightly into the paper from the morning dew. "Justice does not belong to the ones who disrupt it." For a brief moment, her reflection stared back at her in the glass. Tired eyes, steady hands, and a cross pinned just beneath her collar. She read the line again, peeled it from the door, folded it once, and placed it into her drawer. Not out of fear, but for the record. Because every threat was evidence. Every pushback a sign she was exactly where she needed to be. The media grew more divided with each passing day. Some headlines painted her as a reformist hero, the last guardian of the First Amendment. Others labeled her a bureaucratic extremist, dragging the courts into political warfare. Cable news panels turned into shouting matches over her name. Protests formed outside district courts, some in support, others demanding her resignation. Jasmine stayed silent. She refused to be baited into televised battles. Her battlefield was policy, paper, precedent. But the toll was real. She slept in 3-hour windows. Security briefings were added to her morning schedule. Her family was advised to avoid public events. At times, the silence in her office became so loud it pressed against her chest. Yet she never stopped writing, never stopped refining, because every insult hurled at her reforms confirmed exactly why they were necessary. When a reporter asked her during a closed-door session why she hadn't backed down despite the attacks, Jasmine simply replied, "If the system shakes when it's questioned, it was never stable to begin with." She continued drafting the judicial code, now with provisions for whistleblower protection, transparency clauses, and a public complaint registry. Each page became a shield not for her, but for those who would one day sit in courtrooms wearing symbols of faith, belief, and identity. For the ones who wouldn't have a badge, or a camera, or an audience. Just the truth, and a system that had once punished them for it. Jasmine knew what she was building wasn't just controversial, it was revolutionary. And revolutions don't ask for permission. They write new rules, even when the old ones come at them with fists clenched and robes flying. And as the threats deepened and the rhetoric sharpened, Jasmine Crockett made a choice that would echo louder than every whisper behind her back. She did not retreat. She stepped forward. With the nation divided and the judiciary under unprecedented scrutiny, the White House greenlit what would become the most public-facing judicial event in modern American history. A live federal forum titled The Hearing of Hope. It wasn't held behind closed doors. It wasn't limited to press insiders or legal elites. It was televised, streamed, and open to every citizen, a national reckoning in real time. The hearing took place in the National Convention Center, where towering flags flanked the marble stage, and every seat in the 2,000-capacity hall was filled. Judges, faith leaders, law students, whistleblowers, victims. Outside, thousands more gathered, eyes fixed on mobile screens, monitors, and jumbotrons. This wasn't a debate. It was a confrontation with truth. One by one, survivors of judicial bias took the stage. Not celebrities, not officials, but ordinary people who had been silenced in the very rooms where justice was meant to speak. A teenager recounted how his school prayer group had been labeled disruptive during a disciplinary hearing. A Muslim business owner described how his courtroom testimony was dismissed after he refused to remove his prayer cap. A Catholic nurse broke down in tears, recalling the moment a judge asked if she was too religious to think clearly during a labor dispute. Their stories weren't just heartbreaking, they were undeniable. The room didn't applaud, it absorbed. With every voice, the air thickened, not with outrage, but with the heavy weight of reality long denied. Then came the experts, constitutional scholars, professors, former federal prosecutors, all invited to speak not with emotion, but with authority. They reviewed transcripts, highlighted patterns, dissected the Crockett v. Barrett case as if it were a chapter from a future law textbook. One panelist, a former circuit court judge, put it plainly, "This isn't an anomaly, it's a crack in the foundation." Jasmine Crockett didn't expose one judge, she exposed how silence was baked into the process. Camera lenses panned to Jasmine as she listened, her face composed but unreadable. She hadn't spoken all day. She sat at the head table, silver cross gleaming faintly at her collarbone, a silent echo of the moment that started it all. Her hands were folded, her gaze steady. Not once did she interrupt. She was there not as a spectacle, not as the center, but as a witness to the nation's own awakening. Then finally, near the close of the 6-hour hearing, the moderator stood and called her name. The room quieted again. Not like before, when waiting for policy, but as if waiting for permission to feel. Jasmine stood slowly, walked to the center of the stage, and adjusted the microphone. No teleprompter, no speech cards, just her voice, and it cut with the same precision it had in the courtroom. "I didn't come here to teach the law," she began, voice low but strong, filling the silence like a rising tide. "I came here to remind us all, the law is not a weapon, it is a shield meant to protect citizens from power that forgets its purpose." Her words moved without flourish, without dramatics, only with truth, and the undeniable authority of someone who had stood toe-to-toe with the system and refused to blink. Too often we've watched courts become chambers of silence. Too often justice has worn a robe but not a conscience. And too often people of faith, any faith, have been made to choose between belief and dignity. She looked out across the room, rows of faces, some tear-streaked, all waiting. "I don't want thanks. I want reform. I don't want applause. I want policy. And I don't want to be remembered as the one who stood up. I want to be the reason others never have to kneel." The room remained still, no movement, no chatter, just breath held in reverence. "The system didn't fail because it made mistakes," she said in closing. "It failed because it punished those who dared to name them." And with that, she stepped back. The silence that followed was deafening, not because of emptiness, but because it was earned. A silence of truth finally heard, a silence before change, a silence before the storm Jasmine Crockett had been preparing for all along. The kind of silence that comes right before the sound of something greater. Justice, finally waking up. And as the final words of Jasmine's speech echoed through the hearing of hope, leaving the chamber suspended in a silence more powerful than applause, the country took its next breath, not in fear, but in motion. For weeks following the hearing, momentum surged. Her words were replayed across every major network, dissected in classrooms, and printed on posters in civic halls. But more than just conversation, they sparked legislation. After months of deliberation, drafting, and negotiation with the Department of Justice, civil rights organizations, judicial oversight boards, and bipartisan congressional leaders, something once thought impossible became real. The United States Judicial Ethics Code for Religious Liberty, the first federal mandate of its kind, was signed into law. The signing ceremony was brief, purposeful, and broadcast live to the nation. The president, flanked by Jasmine and two representatives from interfaith organizations, spoke only a few words before lifting the pen. This is not about religion. This is about protection, about fairness, about ensuring that no citizen ever walks into a courtroom fearing their faith might silence them. And with the final stroke of ink, the code was ratified. The document, over 200 pages in length, outlined mandatory training for all federal judges, reinforced strict disciplinary consequences for faith-based discrimination, and established an independent watchdog agency with public reporting power. It was dense, detailed, and above all, enforceable. Jasmine had ensured that. She had read every page, line by line, clause by clause, every statute born of the stories she had heard firsthand, every policy written with the steel of a woman who once held a $1,000 fine as both burden and badge. But what followed next would become the most unexpected tribute of all. Weeks after the law was signed, as implementation began across federal courts, an announcement came from the Supreme Court building itself, an institution not known for symbolism or sentiment. The Judicial Historical Society, along with the court's own Preservation Commission, had unanimously approved the installation of a permanent display in the main hall of the Supreme Court. Not a statue of a justice, not a plaque listing names, but something smaller, a bronze sculpture, simple, elegant, exact. It was the image of a necklace, a silver cross caught mid-sway as if still hanging from a collar in defiance. No body, no face, just the chain, captured in motion, frozen in courage. Beneath it, carved into the marble base, were words now etched into the country's conscience. One small symbol, one monumental shift. The installation ceremony was held at dawn, before the building opened to the public. No cameras, no speeches, just a quiet gathering of those who understood what it meant. Jasmine arrived last, dressed simply, blazer pressed, that same silver cross, her father's, now resting once more at her neck. She approached the statue slowly, alone, her heels echoing across the marble floor. And for a long moment, she stood still. Not out of pride, not out of disbelief, but in remembrance, because she remembered what it felt like to be fined for wearing that very symbol. To stand in a courtroom not as a lawyer, not as an official, but as a threat. To be told that her belief didn't belong, not in words but in glares, in gavel slams, in silence. And now the very heart of the institution that once allowed that injustice had been forced to acknowledge it. Not with an apology, but with permanence. Around her the silence held, not cold, not empty, but sacred. A justice of the Supreme Court, quietly stepping forward, broke the stillness with a nod. "We don't honor you because of the controversy," she said, her voice steady. "We honor you because you reminded us what we're supposed to stand for." Jasmine didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her presence said enough. She placed her fingers gently on the edge of the bronze base, where the last line of the engraving ended. Then turning away, she walked back down the hall toward the massive doors, the symbol still shining quietly at her throat. Outside, reporters waited. Supporters gathered. Protesters stood nearby, signs raised. But Jasmine passed through them all, eyes forward, footsteps calm. Because she had never done it for them, or even for herself. She had done it for the ones who still walked into courtrooms afraid to wear what they believed. Now they didn't have to. And inside the most powerful court in the nation, a cross no longer had to be hidden. It stood in bronze, and it would never be moved. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.